Good morning, Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Dr. Vern Baron, a forage/beef researcher with Agriculture Canada and Food.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So Vern, today we're going to be talking about climate change. What does that mean to you?
Well, climate change is a big word, and I think that when we do talk about it, I think it's a good idea to try and define it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a few terms. One is global warming, and that has kind of morphed into climate change, but they are really closely related. And climate change deals with the changing of climate in the long term, like in the long range climate over many years, compared to what it would be in the present. And what does the present mean? Well, most people kind of look at climate change as the change from about the 1960s, when climate started to change rapidly, or global temperatures started to change rapidly, until now and then into the future. And we're talking to end of century now and beyond, let's say into the future. But climate really started to change in the sense of how humans impacted climate for the whole globe at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that really started impacting average temperatures at about the beginning of the 20th century. So the changes were very small at first and then are gaining in momentum.
Well, I agree with you. Climate is changing, but I have questions about to what extent human activity has actually been a factor. Because I find that the whole focus on carbon seems to be kind of demonizing something which is useful for agriculture. Plus, it's not that simple, right? It's not just carbon dioxide, there's also the nitrous oxides, as the federal government now is talking about controlling nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers. I haven't actually seen a lot of science that sort of can differentiate human activity and effect from other non-human activities or non-human factors that change climate. But yeah, I agree. Climate is definitely changing, and it comes down to how do we build in resilience? I hate that phrase because it's so overused, but resilience in our agricultural systems to make sure that we continue to eat properly, right?
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing all of your question, but I think that what we want to talk about here is how do we know that the climate change that we're talking about, which is caused by humans, climate change is actually occurring. What we have to do is kind of sort out what you would see on a day-to-day basis or even regionally, and talk about, first of all, about what the global changes, and that's where the big changes occur. And as I said before, the smaller changes that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century were barely perceptible. And we have climate and weather changes occurring in our counties and locally all of the time.
Yeah.
But when we talk about climate change globally, we're seeing things like, as you said, the greenhouse gases that are man-made, like nitrous oxide, methane, and extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they are increasing. And we can measure those concentrations and see that they are increasing. And so we do know that they're getting larger. For example, when I first started work at Lacombe over 30 years ago, we could measure carbon dioxide in parts per million in the air around 350 parts per million. And now we're measuring in about 400. So, that gives you an
That's
idea.
significant increase.
This will continue to occur. And so we know that those greenhouse gases are occurring, and they're added to other gases in the atmosphere, like water vapor is a big one.
Oh, yeah.
All of those gases, including water vapor, impact climate. And what we're talking about, though, besides that, so those greenhouse gases are increasing. And what has also happened over our lifetimes, Harry, I don't know if you remember when the Sputnik Russian satellite first was shot above the atmosphere. I can remember because my family was out shoveling grain during harvest.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a big flash in the sky about that time. And it turned out that the Russian rockets were going up there and placing space stations. So what that allows us to do now there's just a whole lot of garbage in the above the atmosphere.
Oh, yes.
That can detect changes in temperature and many things that are happening on the Earth. One of the things that they can do is measure the radiation, or the solar radiation, or radiation of any kind, or temperature coming off the Earth. And what they see on an annual basis is just a slight gradual increase in the energy that's contained within the atmosphere that surrounds the Earth. And so we have one temperature that's occurring in the atmosphere, at the bottom of the atmosphere, at the top of the atmosphere, and right at ground level. And so we see that, and you have to go back, and so it's just edging up over years. So we have a limited amount of data on that because satellites haven't been in the atmosphere as long as the Earth has been around, but I can tell you that they're going to be there for a long time to come. So we see that the energy balance of the Earth is edging upward and causing temperatures held within the atmosphere to increase. Or is it increasing drastically? No. If you looked at it on a per decade basis, the average annual temperature of the Earth, which may be, 1, 2, 4 degrees C or whatever, it goes up about 0.2 of a degree centigrade a decade. And so when we start to talk about limiting the warming, global warming by 1.5, and you hear that all the time, that means we're trying to keep that increase in the Earth's temperature at 1.5. It's almost an impossible task.
Well, it is.
So, that's when you start talking out 2030, 2050, the end of the century, where are we going to be in temperature? So there's that. And then what we're seeing also is the decrease in the Arctic and Antarctic ice fields. They're decreasing and sea levels are rising. So consequently, there's enough evidence, and then you go back, there's enough evidence. Besides that, what I didn't mention was tree rings and rates of melting of ice and icebergs. So all of these things add up to tell you something is happening beyond the average or the expected.
Well,
and that's what climate change is.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Climate is changing, and it's an extremely complicated system. And what really bothers me is the whole just concentrating on carbon dioxide, plus the fact that we could zero out our carbon dioxide emissions, say, hypothetically, right? But unless the big emitters do something about it, what's going to change?
Well, first of all, let's go back to the greenhouse effect and say, do we need global warming? Absolutely, we need global warming. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect, and the greenhouse effect helps to keep some of that solar radiation that comes from the sun through the atmosphere to the Earth's surface. If we didn't have the atmosphere and water vapor and so on holding some of that radiation near the Earth's level, we would probably be 30 degrees C cooler than we are now.
I don't think I want to wear my winter coat in the middle of summer
No.
or try to
So-
grow anything.
So there is what we would call in scientific terms a steady state achieved, so that, given a certain amount outgoing, given a certain amount incoming, that's good for everybody. But we also talk about this whole business of the average temperature, and we don't speak in those terms from our
Yeah.
farms and towns and so on and so forth.
It's today's weather we talk about.
We talk about the weather, we talk about the average temperature, and we talk about the maximums and minimums and all of these sorts of things. And so what we know from that is that we just know that at the equator, it's going to be over 40 degrees C during the summer, and it's got short days, and we've got seasons and so on and so forth. That isn't going to change. The average temperatures will change, but the differences between Lacombe and Stettler and Lethbridge and Brandon and wherever we are, Miami, Florida, they're still going to be different. The changes are not the same in all places around the globe. And that makes it
Yeah.
easy to question climate change. And it also makes us ask the question of, well, what the heck do we do about it?
Personally, I don't like the idea of demonizing carbon dioxide. I would much rather go on a consumption basis and conservation basis. For me, would be make a lot more sense, and use that as an approach as opposed to carbon. I find it just too damn simplistic. And it also smacks a little bit of arrogance, thinking that we can actually control the weather. I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about it, but I think there's better ways of going about it than this.
Well, those are good questions. And it kind of brings you back, though, to if you looked at what is the reporting mechanisms that we have in Canada and internationally about climate change tries to account for all of these things. And to bring it back closer to home, we kind of have to think about who is emitting all these greenhouse gases, and if we did do something about it, would it make a difference? First of all, from agriculture's point of view, annually, both in the United States and Canada, we emit about 8 to 10% of the nation's greenhouse gas emission.
Okay.
Those are the emissions that could cause, global warming,
Right.
for example, or climate change. So agriculture has a small part to play at that. And the other 90% is composed largely of carbon dioxide emissions, which is largely fossil fuels and heating, transportation, and all of those sorts of things. But we know we live in a country like Canada where we want to stay warm in the winter, and we have long distances to travel.
Yep.
So there's only so much we can do about that. And, we can increase efficiencies and so on. And we're quite familiar with some of the methods that they're trying to do that. But coming back to agriculture, what can agriculture do? Well, I would say agriculture can do some things. Most of the things that we have to do that are useful tend to increase the efficiency of production.
Like
in
the
agriculture,
4 hours of fertilizer.
Yeah. We can subdivide that 10% into maybe 17 to 20% that is from on-farm fuel. We can do some things about that. Zero tillage was one of the biggest impacts, like one pass farming. Reduces fossil fuels, efficient tractors, that sort of thing can come to play there. And in the beef enterprise, extended grazing, our biggest savings with swath grazing, dormant grass or stockpiled grass, not so much bale grazing, but anything that reduces the use of tractors and feeding practices,
It's a
or
benefit.
all of those sorts of things can reduce your energy requirement in feeding to about 50%. So that's quite effective. It's
Mhm.
just how many days of the conventional winter feeding are you reducing? But they do work. And
Yeah,
what you're doing there is that you're taking essentially taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere before it even gets there. So yes, you're doing a little bit, and all of these things are called mitigation practices. Recently, the federal government has gone through what we call a development of the greenhouse gas emission pathway, how to reduce emission through practices. And of course, one of the biggest ones that appears could be quite effective is reduced emissions from nitrogen fertilizers. So that would be nitrous oxide emission through the low emission or slow release
yeah,
fertilizers. So the goal there is to reduce the emission from the use of those fertilizers by 30%.
right.
And theoretically, we're almost there. The downside of that is, yeah, you're right. It's going to cost more money. And so where they do work and they work well, it may be that we can produce the same yield with less fertilizer because we're probably losing less of the nitrogen that could be taken
Right.
off. It doesn't always work that way, as you know, that weather has a whole lot to do with the effectiveness of fertilizer that you
Right.
apply. But
Denitrification and flooded soils, right?
yeah, so that's a big deal. That's a big deal for agriculture. But we have to remember that our job in society in agriculture is to produce food. So we, with the hostilities going on in the world right now and the impacts of war on regions that are big food producers, the United States and Canada are going to be called upon to produce a lot of food to make up that deficit. How are we going to do that? Likely we're going to have to use more fertilizer and more land.
If we can get it.
If we can get it, yeah.
And that's because, so much of the fertilizer comes from, there's significant amounts come from Ukraine and Russia as well.
Yeah. So there's always arguments and conflicts about whether we're wise to cut this out to make a savings for something that may be a benefit to society 50, 100 years from now.
You're saying urgency is overcoming long-term planning.
It almost always does.
Yeah, because that makes sense.
It's the same with the reality.
It seems like farmers, it's the reason farmers often do what they do is not because of their long-term planning, but because they have to satisfy the banker tomorrow or this year for this year's farm. Because most of them know how to farm better if they had to.
In another thing that, as a federal government, you will hear more about this in the future, is the Living Labs projects that are going on. And I've been involved in some of that. We don't know the outcomes of it.
Could you explain that one? I'm not aware of that one.
Well, the Living Labs projects are a way of bringing environmental research to the farm level, because of the idea that if anything is going to happen in agriculture for climate change, that the change has to be carried out on the farm.
Yeah.
And there has always been, rightly or wrongly, and I have my own opinions about this, is that research centers and universities don't do enough actually on the farm with farmers. Is that true? I would argue with that, but let's just say that that's part of the reasoning behind the Living Labs concept. So I guess where I was going with the Living Labs idea is that in that whole process and talking to farmers
Mhm.
and going to a lot of these focus groups like the Western Grains Foundations, where they set priorities for research, farmers really have a high regard for climate. And whereas we may think many farmers don't believe that global warming exists, many do. And many see it, climate changing around them. On the other side of it, farms are getting larger and labor is scarce. And so the ability to make the kinds of changes that I might say a person or family should do aren't
Mhm.
possible simply because of the cost and the labor required to make that change. Now, we also see that farms are getting larger and farms are getting smaller. There are a lot more big farms, there are a lot more little farms.
The middle
How do you
guys are
make,
disappearing. Yeah.
well, some of the little guys are disappearing, but there's some specialized organic farms and all of these sorts of
Mhm.
things. We never ever do things one way. Anyway, the thing is that those large farmers have problems with changes and so on and so forth. They perhaps know that they're breaking land and farming land that probably shouldn't be farmed. If it was put into grass, for which would be good for carbon sequestration, they don't have the time to fence. They don't have the time to cattle. There has to be some, if they're going to participate in some of these things, which they believe in, they have to have help from somebody or their neighbors who have cattle or something like this.
You
And
need to,
so,
yeah.
and so there has to be some kind of compatibility sorted out. To use the word synergy is a word that's way overused,
Oh, yeah.
but partnerships developed so that some of these things can happen. Because given the kinds of fiscal constraints that farmers are under now, it's hard to make changes unless you're obviously going to make money out of them.
It seems that, like, especially when you get to really large size, the farmer no longer becomes the farmer. He's actually the manager. So then your
Mhm.
employees do all the farming. And because they're employees, they have to keep things simple. And it seems to me that they go towards a recipe type farming method where it's okay, keep it simple, wheat, barley, maybe peas, canola, but a very simple rotation with maybe only 2 or 3 crops. And then you have your recipe list of things that you do for each thing. If it's wheat, we provide this much fertilizer, mostly because they can't treat each individual piece of land as an individual piece. There's just not the time, right? If you've got 20,000 acres to go over and get seeded within about a 3-4 week period, it's just go and, pedal to the metal till you get it all done. And then it's time to do the spraying. So it becomes almost formulaic. And I don't think that is really doing a big favor for our landscape. I know in our county, we've seen an inordinate amount of clearing of any brush spots because land's expensive. And any
Yeah.
acre they can get is cheaper than buying the next quarter for $1 million. And so that it tends to make the landscape very uniform, takes out all the bush, you keep your field efficiencies at the maximum, but it's long-term. I don't think it's sustainable.
Well, one of the things that will have to happen if we put enough value into what we would call mitigating climate change.
Yeah.
There's two sides of this, mitigating and adapting to it. The research that occurs and the engineering that occurs and so on, some emphasis will have to be put into thinking about how we deal with climate change, because we're not going to stop climate change on a dime.
Not ourselves,
And so
anyways.
farms will get bigger and land prices will get higher and more pressures will get put on people. But things like residue management become really important, and that may affect crop choices. And so what we find producers wanting is advice
Mhm.
about what to do. And so I guess the challenge for researchers in the future, if we're going to deal with things like yield stability,
Mhm.
that's what we all want.
Yeah.
We want to be able to say, we can afford to grow a bushel of wheat or a bushel of barley or a bushel of canola for this amount of money. We have to make more than that, or we can't grow it. So we have to find ways that producers can afford and also sustain their production, and perhaps little by little reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emission, but at the same time try to figure out how they can deal with the changing climate, because the climate is going to change.
Oh, yes.
Because of natural causes, and B, because as it's affected by climate change. And I think we should go back and talk a bit about that. If you use the
Okay.
example of droughts in North America are largely caused not necessarily by climate change in quotations, but in other words, global warming.
Yeah.
Global warming plays a role, but climate droughts are caused primarily from the El Nino effect, and also on just those droughts to the prairies that begin in the Gulf of Mexico. Warming occurs and the heat is stored near the land surface instead of moving up into the atmosphere. And that brings moisture up from the soil into the air because it's warming. And this moves up from, Texas right up through Saskatchewan into southern Alberta and Manitoba. And those are the causes of our major droughts. But what happens with climate change and global warming is that the maximum temperatures that occur during that time are increased.
Mhm.
And that increases the impact of the temperatures and sucks more moisture out into the atmosphere. Which then brings us to the other issues of the really intense weather events that occurs, either high temperature droughts or a lot of
Catastrophic
rain at one
rains.
time,
Yeah.
or snowfall. And so what happens is that the atmosphere can occur in the form of water vapor than it did before because of climate change, because the temperatures are higher. And as those air masses move around the globe in a little different manner, at some point, that energy has to be released in the atmosphere, and very intense rainfall occurs and hailstorms and so on. So climate change does affect the weather, and what producers notice most, I think, is likely those intense weather events.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's where things pivot on a dime, right? You have a great crop coming and then a hailstorm wipes it out, or no rain like last summer. Was especially with the intense heat, it was a little unusual having the heat show up so early in the season. Usually that's something that occurs in August, those really high temperatures. I find that if you really want a divisive topic, climate change, and like there's parties on both sides, right? What bothers me most about the whole climate discussion is that it no longer becomes a discussion, but it becomes a my tribe, your tribe type of a situation where you get labeled if you have any questions. I would really love to see people debating the issue with the science in front of them. But most people don't seem to want to spend the time to either dig it up or to understand it, because it is very complicated.
The science is very complicated. There are entities or groups, interest groups, and so on and so forth that want to take advantage of climate change, both either in anti-climate change or pro-climate change.
Yeah.
And they do cause their problems. And, in terms of what we can do for agriculture is to understand more about it. And can we respond to climate change? A lot of responding to climate change on the farm has to do with known and good agronomic practices.
Yeah.
When we talk to producers compared to 15 to 20 years ago, because climate change has been around a while,
Yeah.
there is a better understanding of what's happening in climate change now than there was 20 years ago. That's not to say that it's a well understood topic, because it gets into the pro side of we should be paid for carbon sequestration, or will carbon sequestration do anything? All of these things, and often the processes, the scientific processes behind all of these practices or things we could do or not do are not well understood. Or, what we have is a situation, when you talk about carbon credits, there is the biological side to carbon credits, but there's also the legal and contractual side to carbon credits, and the monetary return for carbon credits, and so on and so forth, and the political side to carbon credits.
Oh, and that's
And
huge.
all of these things all are mixed into a big bowl, and you can end up on the pro or anti side of them and still believe in climate change. So yes, it's very complicated.
It was just, I keep wishing there'd be some way that we could recognize good stewardship. Like us, I like trees, so I see nothing wrong with keeping a ring of trees around a wet area or ephemeral sloughs. And, but I mean, with the profit motive driving things so much in the agricultural community, producers getting bigger and bigger equipment, they don't see the value of those sloughs. They're just impediments to their ability to farm the land. And we need to develop, it seems to me, we need to develop some way of giving a financial recognition to defer or deter them rather from eliminating those spots. Because it's, I see it in various places where, as I go back and forth to work, where there's areas where there's not a tree to be seen. And it's kind of, I won't call it an environmental wasteland, but it affects the hydrology of the area as well. And I see it becoming less able to handle droughty conditions. And so you get greater variability in yield. Whereas if you could find some way of a financial reward, maybe we could leave these sloughs and stuff have more consistent results despite the weather condition or the climate changing. But it could be a win-win situation. But the way it's going now is we're heading down a path I don't see as being terribly sustainable. And I hate that phrase too, by the way. Overused.
Well, there isn't an easy answer for that example that you gave, and it is one of the things that is, way more than two-sided.
Yeah.
Farms are getting larger, and the answer to your question, the theoretical answer to your question about what about the low producing areas, like one of the most important things to look at is the amount of greenhouse gas that is emitted per kilogram or per bushel of crop that's produced. Like that's really important. So that's not hard to do. That's not too hard to do in many places. If you get your inputs right or optimized and so on, like you're having your nitrogen work for you instead of your nitrogen fertilizer work for you instead of simply emitting fertilizer. But where you run into problems, probably on a farm basis, is late planted crops that are going to yield low. These are things that you can't do a lot about, but it occurs all the time. And those low producing areas on fields like saline spots and so on, which often occur around sloughs and wetlands.
We got a lot of those.
Yeah, so we kind of know and producers, for the most part, would prefer not to have to farm those parts because they're not making money off that part.
Exactly, yeah.
But the other side of it is that from a theoretical basis, precision agriculture is supposed to solve these problems, as in variable fertilizer rates and so on. But what we're kind of told is that a lot of this stuff falls into the hands of custom operators and so on and so forth, who don't have really a vested interest in the stewardship of land and so on. And so, so a lot of those things, if that would be one of the practices that we would use to reduce emission and probably make some money for farmers, we would have to find some ways that are compatible with farming practices to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And until we focus on those things, that's not going to happen. If we just kind of ignore them, then we can't do much about it. And we have to go back to this whole business of, okay, producers and the public want to be paid for their contribution to climate change. But on the other hand, they don't want to be charged for what they're not doing.
And they don't want to pay any more than they have to. Yeah.
No, and that's human nature. So I think one of the biggest things we have to do is learn more about how climate change and the different avenues and approaches to climate change that is in the future. How do we adapt? How do we adapt to growing crops and raising cattle and sheep and whatever under these conditions? Or how are we going to have to change farming operations if we saw the maximum temperatures were to change, like having a whole month of temperatures above 30 degrees C in central Alberta? We would be more like Lethbridge. So what's Lethbridge or southern Alberta and Swift Current going to do? Yes. What are they going to do when they have 2 to 3 months of that kind of weather?
Yeah.
And it becomes a factor of, well, I guess we better manage water then. As opposed to just thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So all of these things are not going to be solved by Harry and Vern talking about them on a podcast.
Yeah.
They are things where society has to work on these things together. Whether science is the best approach or not, we don't know, but it's one of the best avenues that we have to tell us what the truth is.
And I think that's the biggest thing, is trying to find the truth in a lot, because there's so much misinformation, or even information that's right, but it's spun a certain way, or there's so many ways to interpret it and to present it. And that's where it gets confusing, right?
Well, misinformation in all areas of society, and we've seen it over the last 10 to 15 years, max out, is probably our largest enemy. And having said that, we have to think about this area of climate change as something that is going to continue in the future. And we're just, to use a bad term, at tip of the iceberg of information about climate change per se, how it impacts societies around the world, and then in our smaller world, how it affects agriculture in North America and Alberta.
Mm-hmm. Now, if I was going to give somebody advice, the only thing I would say is get educated, get informed, do your own research. And don't just go with your own biases when you're doing research. It's way too much BS that's been spread out there and taken as fact. The whole quote that Mark Twain said came from Benjamin Disraeli, which was that there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And it's statistics that seem to be abused and misused so many different ways.
Well, what I would say is that we can listen to the best snake oil salesman we can find
Yep.
from other parts in the world. We can listen to the best science that we get from other parts in the world and claim that it's better than what we have.
Mm-hmm.
But the solutions to agricultural problems on the farm in Canada are likely going to be solved in Canada.
Yeah.
And if you can find people that you trust in terms of their knowledge, and I think that's a big deal. Who do you trust?
Yeah.
And how do Harry and Vern get people to trust them? Lord only knows. It's kind of like a track record and how you approach people. But the thing is that I think that that's your best bet if you want to have some accurate and sound advice, is to find that advice as locally as you can and the best science that you can find, and expect that you will find differences of opinion and different approaches, and a high likelihood that none of them are wrong and none of them are 100% right.
Oh yeah. You could say that life, we like to think of it as being black and white, but it's mostly shades of gray.
Well, what we tried to do here today, Harry, is to move away from some of the shades of gray on climate change and get some things a little bit more well-defined. And I think that's a good start.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vern. I appreciate your time and your comments.